Welcome to the K-State Regen Ag Pod, where we talk all things regenerative agriculture here at Kansas State University, across the state of Kansas and beyond. I'm Nick Detter, your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Logan Thompson, Professor of Sustainable Livestock Feeding from the Department of Animal Science and Industry. Thank you for joining us, Logan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, I think to start off, what I like to ask all of our guests is just to have them introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their background, how they got in the position they're currently in, and what they're doing here at K-State.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm originally from Central Texas. Grew up the son of a cow hand on a registered horned Hereford outfit. So I'm still very partial to horned Hereford cattle, which I tell everybody just means I like to treat pink eye. And I've had a kind of a winding road to get to K-State. I think this is my sixth university since I left home. And I'm sure my wife hopes this is the last stop. But started my college career at a small university called Sam Houston State. And from there, I went to Texas Tech, where I finished my undergrad, and that's where I got interested in sustainability. As a freshman, I remember driving to Huntsville, where Sam Houston is, and I recall seeing all these developments that were on ranches that I used to work calves on as a kid, now as the greater Austin metro. And land use change really stuck with me. So I decided very early on to pursue sustainable beef production as a career. That morphed into other areas just because there's other areas that are popular. But that's been pretty true. That use of land and keeping working lands working is still a passion of mine to this day. After Tech, I went to Oklahoma State University, where I did my master's. Did a lot of wheat grazing down there. It's a really important production system for Oklahoma, southern Kansas, northern Texas. And then from Oklahoma State, I went to Michigan State for my PhD, which is very different than any other grazing system I've ever been a part of. When you can hear grass grow, the potential is a little bit different from a production standpoint. And it also snowed there, which was pretty new for me. And after I graduated there, went to Colorado State University for a postdoc position, and that's when I started getting more into the feedlot side of things, and then was able to get a position here at K-State and started in August of 2022. So I've been here just over 3 years now. I originally was primarily a teaching professor, and then I switched over to research and extension about a year ago, and I run a 3,000-acre stocker facility south of Manhattan, Kansas, called the Hylas Bay and Emma Browning Reynolds Flint Hill Prairie Preserve. And mostly stocker cattle, have some interest in goats and things like that, but beef production is our primary focus from a research and extension standpoint.
Oh, that's great. So you talked a little bit about your interest in sustainability when it comes to the livestock. Can you speak just more broadly to how livestock and livestock production and I mean your title of sustainable livestock feeding, how that fits into this bigger conversation of regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, so I'm not that old, but to date myself a little, when I got into further into my scientific career, sustainability was the hot topic of the day. But when I went to Michigan State, I went there very intentionally to get a very specific experience, and it was focused on regenerative agriculture and using livestock as a tool to improve landscape health, ecosystem function, right? And a good way to think about it, at least as it was described to me, and I've since told the person I've used this over and over, right now we're in Manhattan, Kansas, right? We were just talking about California before we jumped on this recording. Drive from Manhattan, Kansas out to California, right? You're going to see a lot of rangelands, right? Different types, different structures, different uses. What keeps those landscapes healthy and thriving? Right? It's animals. It's livestock animals. And those are our tools to keep range in range, because we're losing a lot of it, right? We lose millions of acres of rangeland every year to, other land uses, marginal cropping systems, development, what have you. I think there's a big benefit there. And regenerative ag, at least in my viewpoint, focuses on the land, right? So rather than the traditional economic focus that producers have, which is not wrong, right? You have to make money to be sustainable, but it's really making intentional decisions to improve certain aspects of your land, right? And soil health is a part of that, but there's other avenues as well that people pursue to improve. So that's kind of my interpretation of what regenerative ag is and how beef fit into it.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned when you went to Michigan State, you specifically did some work related to regenerative ag, and would you mind talking about either that work or some of the work you're doing here at Kansas State and how that kind of is working towards that vision of a sustainable regenerative future for livestock production?
Yeah, so my lab group at Michigan State was, and still is, I believe, a savory hub. Intensive grazing system, right? A heavy rotational grazing system. And that was something I was introduced to as a kid in the previous iteration of the Savory Institute. And I wanted that training because it was very different, right? It was very different than what I would call most production grazing management of semi-continuous rotational grazing, right? We're on places for a long period of time, usually at the same time every year. And I started some work there actually in northeastern Alabama, comparing intensive grazing, so a heavy rotational grazing system that's focused on improving soil health outcomes, to a continuous grazing system. So we had pairs of ranches down there that we were working with, which meant I was not in Michigan very often. Some summers, usually I was in a hotel in Alabama. And we saw some really promising things from an animal standpoint in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We saw some benefit to rotational grazing that also lined up with our collaborators on the soil side, seeing improvements in soil carbon and nitrogen stocks on rotationally grazed pastures. And with that being, a non-traditional research design, as in it's not technically true replication, right? It's more of an observational study. We have since continued that work. We just wrapped up 2 years worth of grazing data collection in South Dakota with the same project, same design. We pulled our equipment home, I think last week. So starting to go through that data to see how it's different, because geographies across the United States, right, the production systems are always different. The forages are different, the cattle are different. So we're trying to figure out, what works best where from an animal standpoint, and then tying that in with our collaborators at other universities who are looking at wildlife habitat, social dynamics, soil stocks, right, the other aspects that go into a working ranch.
Yeah. How do some of those principles apply here in Kansas?
To rotational grazing?
Yep.
Yeah, so we're in a very unique production system here in the Flint Hills of Kansas. We are largely a stalker dependent beef production system. There is some cow-calf, but it's by and large it's stalkers, and most of them are not rotationally grazed. There has been some older data that's tried to look at rotationally grazing stalker cattle, but not a whole lot, right? So I think there's some meat on the bone from that standpoint in terms of how best can we move 700-pound calves across a Flint Hills ranch in a way that's going to make us money and also not be a headache, which stalkers usually are. They like to get into trouble. But another aspect that we have is a lot of readily available crop ground, which would be a different viewpoint on rotational grazing, right? I think here we should focus a lot of time on integrating livestock into cropping systems. It is one of my pet peeves as I drive across Kansas is there's not enough temporary fence up around corn stalks, right, or triticale or wheat. And I think that's a huge opportunity cost for us. We have a lot of value outside of the monetary value of upcycling that crop ground into protein, but there's shown in other regions a lot of benefits in terms of pest control, weed control, improvements to soil health and cycling nutrients in that stubble or that weed or the triticale, back below ground. And I'm hopeful through the Regen Center here that we're able to encourage more of that behavior with producers by showing them how it works and that it does work and it can be done, right?
Yeah, definitely integrating animals into crop systems, I think, is one of the kind of core principles that we talk about regularly with our region center, like you said. What do you think are some of the challenges that keep producers from working towards the integration? I know you mentioned the temporary fence, so there's probably an infrastructure upfront investment, and I'm sure there's some level of labor investment, and maybe there's cultural things, but could you just speak to that a little bit about what you see and what you hear when you talk to producers in the state of Kansas of what keeps them from making that switch over to an integrated crop livestock system?
Yeah, a lot of what I hear and have read in some of our social science research that people at K-State have done, the labor aspect is a big one, right? A lot of people, I take for example, I live northeast of Topeka, Kansas. Integrated cattle crop fields all over the place, but most of the time, those guys who run both, they still bring their cows in the wintertime and hay them, right? Because it's easier to do. And so I think we need to provide some results that say, hey, there's a lot of monetary benefit that can be obtained by integrating. And there's, by the way, all these other benefits to your crop ground, right? So it's not just money for your cows, but there's also benefits to your crop ground in terms of potentially lower inputs needed to keep that system functioning. And that reminds me, that's another very central aspect to what regenerative ag is, that is different than, say, the organic movement of the 80s and 90s, or even the sustainability movement of the 2000s and 2010s. Regenerative ag it can sometimes be confusing to producers because they think that we want to take tools away from them, which is not what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Right? All these tools still exist in your toolbox. We just want to make sure that our production systems aren't relying on any one tool too much, because that negatively impacts the resiliency of the operation. Right? And that was a little bit of an aside, but I think that is an important distinction to make in terms of what regenerative ag is.
I completely agree. One question I've received from a producer when I was talking to him about all of our regen ag principles, and I brought up integrating livestock and into cropping systems, he voiced concerns about compaction. Is that something? Do you have any thoughts on that? On how producers that want to go down? Are there any pitfalls producers that might be interested in integrating livestock into their cropping system should be aware of, such as compaction? And if so, what kind of things should they do to make sure they don't run into any of those problems?
Yeah, I mean, compaction can happen, right? And I think of compaction as being a result of, not getting your stocking rate and timing down correctly. Right? It's similar, in my opinion, to manure spreading. Right? You want to spread manure at the right time of year. You want to integrate cattle into cropping systems at the right time as well. Right? If we are anticipating higher rainfall, say, in I'll just make this up, in March of next year. Right? Weather forecast says we're going to get more rainfall. Maybe don't graze around that time. Right? If you add a whole lot of hoof impact onto soggy soil, and especially soils of certain textures, which is somewhat out of my area of expertise, we can have compaction. Another thing I like to point out, livestock aren't cattle. Right? Cattle are livestock, but not all livestock are cattle. There's other ways to integrate livestock other than grazing cattle. Right? In Flint Hills, we do have goats, we do have sheep. Right? Goats they're more browsers, but sheep are more similar. Right? They can be introduced, and we want to have the compaction concerns because they weigh quite a bit less than cattle. But again, timing is a key aspect, and knowing what your soil textures and characteristics are, so you can better identify pastures where you'll have a lower risk for compaction.
Yeah, could you speak a little bit more to that sheep and goat grazing component? I think that's something we don't hear as much about, when we think about integrating livestock into the system. I know you mentioned it, the operation you guys are running outside of Manhattan. You have some sheep down there. Is that what you said? Or
yeah, we're trying to figure out the right avenue to get some goats out there, particularly, and what we have in the Flint Hills is a very complicated relationship with red cedar. Right? And also a complicated relationship with our neighbors. Not in a negative way, it's just we have more neighbors today. So we have more landscape fragmentation and people managing for different reasons. And as that has occurred, we get more and more red cedar. And I personally feel like that is a bad thing, but it's also an opportunity, right? And goats can be a wonderful tool to help manage red cedar, but also increase revenue. Right? If you look under a cedar tree, we were actually just out there this morning talking about this. If you look under a cedar tree, there's no grass, right? So potentially, how much landscape can we pull back if we include goats? And then also in areas of encroachment where those stands haven't taken hold, can we use goats and fire together to reduce the encroachment or to slow it down, right? And that is something that's going to take years and years of work to figure out. But it is a tool that is different, requires different type of labor. But I think there's some added value there.
Yeah, I think that's really promising. I know that cedar encroachment is definitely a concern in the ways that it can degrade, some of our pristine prairies here in Kansas. So it's exciting to hear the different tools we're working on to address that issue. One other thing I wanted to talk with you about is that we have our Regen Ag farm up at the North Farm, just north of campus, and where we're kind of trying to do some of these systems and implement some of these Regen Ag practices at a little bit bigger of a scale than we would normally do in plot research. And I know that you're kind of involved in the work to make at least some of those systems, some of those fields be an integrated crop livestock system. Could you speak to that work and where that's headed at all?
Yeah, so Dr. Rice and his team have set aside some fields on the North Farm here to undergo some different cropping rotations, and my team would be involved in the livestock grazing component of those rotations. So we have a field this past year. It was planted in triticale, and we had intentions to graze it, but it was kind of a odd winter in that it was extremely cold and then also kind of dry at inopportune times, and so the stand never really got big enough for us to put enough animals out there to really, do what we wanted to do. But the next cycle should be 2027 is when that field I believe is scheduled to get grazed again, and so we'll line up some cattle and try to get it done. And I also think that's a good lesson in regenerative ag is you don't have to do any one thing if it doesn't work, right? You're not stuck to any one approach, which I think there's a lesson in life in that. And hopefully what we'll see is at least what I would like to see is a change in soil health in those fields. My PhD is in animal science, but I spent more time measuring soil than I did anything else. So I'm not sure how I became a ruminant nutritionist at Michigan State. But up there, we did see some benefits in terms of labile, carbon, and nitrogen fractions in those integrated systems in Southwest Michigan. So I think there's some promise there. And then I also think it's a wonderful place to, at the very least, introduce folks to the concept. Right, it's very visible. It's going to be larger, right, than, as you mentioned, normal plot size research, and so I think it's going to be a great tool from that standpoint. It just lowers the barrier for entry, right, into what regenerative ag is, because it's going to be super, super visible. It's right off the road. You can't miss it, right?
Yeah, if you're going to football games, it's right there at College and Marlatt, yep. And so you might, if you see cows out there, you'll know why now. For all you K-State football fans out there, could you speak a little bit more to that relationship between integrating crops and livestock and soil health? I mean, I think from my perspective, I think this is one of the really exciting things about our partnership with you guys here in the agronomy department and with animal sciences. I think, as agronomists, we haven't done a great job at doing research into the impacts of how integrating livestock into crop systems can be a benefit of soil health. I think that's part of it, just not our expertise. And so I mean, I've tried to read through a few of the studies, and if you ever look through, the agronomy studies on this stuff, it's kind of all over the place. So it sounds like you've done some actually really promising work and been more familiarized with some of that work. So could you just talk a little bit about, the soil, a little bit more about the soil health impacts and how that work? Why you mentioned you saw these benefits in labile carbon and labile nitrogen. Why do we see those benefits to the soil when we integrate livestock into our cropping systems?
Yeah, so again, this is an animal scientist pretending to know anything about soil. But what we kind of hypothesize is we're more quickly recycling, like take a field of triticale. Right? That's a wonderful forage. It's high in protein. Right? If you let that protein just stay above ground, eventually the plant kind of withers away, or we terminate the stand, right? And the carbon leaves, right? Not all of that carbon is going back down. Actually, very little of it will go back down into the ground, right? When we graze it with animals, we are constantly cycling that nitrogen and carbon and nitrogen back into the soil, and we're doing that because we are urinating, defecating. Well, cattle are urinating and defecating, and maybe you're a rancher, all on various parts of the field. But they're also trampling it, right? So they're providing close contact to that plant, to soil microbes, and when soil microbes kind of need to be close to the plant in order to begin decomposing it. So those are the two primary ways. And with say corn stalks, for example, that's going to be a lot more of the carbon, right? There's not a whole lot of nitrogen in corn stalks, but that's going to cycle a lot of that above ground. I call it carbon skeletons because that's all that makes sense to me in my ruminant nutrition head. But we'll cycle that back into the ground via those same mechanisms, right? Get to close contact via trampling, and then also urination and defecation. And then the last aspect I would add in is, and this is a little bit harder to prove scientifically, but there's also hoof action, right? As cattle move across a pasture, right? They can kind of break up some crusts in soil where they exist just by moving, right? And that'll improve water infiltration possibly when there's a crust that's formed. And it won't happen all the time, but it can help improve that. That is hard to prove scientifically. I will note all of that, but that is a theory behind it as well.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. We're excited to see, the more results we get, maybe even some results up at the North Farm where we can prove it here in Manhattan. Another question I had for you is, I'm familiar with some research, and I know K-State has done some research, and you've talked a little bit about how the integrating of livestock can be a profitability boost. It's a really good opportunity, particularly with cover crops. I know that's one of the ways you can make cover crops work economically is by utilizing it as a forage and a grazing forage. If cover crops, what's interesting, I like how you kind of framed regenerative agriculture as this set of tools that we can use, do different things with and meet different objectives with. So I think cover crops are the perfect example of that. Is different utilization of cover crops can accomplish different things. But I guess my question would be is if a producer was very interested in grazing their cover crops and your specialties kind of in sustainable feeding, what kind of is a mix better from a nutrition standpoint for the animal? Is a single species situation better? When it comes into selecting cover crops, if your intention is to graze them, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the first thing I always think about is, what does my soil need, right? Because that's the ultimate goal is to help your soil out with those mixes. You're also keeping soil covered, which is good in another regen staple, right? But think about what your soils need. We've grazed brassicas before very successfully. They're high moisture content, but they're really good forages. But I use them as an example because they're basically fumigants, right? They'll alter your soil microbial communities quite a bit because they're fumigants. So while they might be beneficial to the animal, are they going to set your land back, right? But in general, I think diversity is always good. I know there's some producers in parts of Kansas that take that to the extreme, which they fascinate me when they do it. But when we think about the benefit of diversity, we're really saying we want to put all these plants introduce all these plants out here, because hopefully, regardless of what happens with the weather, which is outside of our control, something is liable to grow, right? And there can be some symbiotic relationships in there as well. Another example I like to use is, we have fescue in the southeast part of the state, right? We can actually graze infected fescue better when we plant, say, bird's foot trefoil in the pasture, because the bird's foot has secondary compounds that negate the toxin in the infected fescue, right? So there is symbiotic relationships that can happen when we have diversity in our pastures. And I know that was just one from pasture to crop ground, but I think that's a really fun example. And I would say, on like corn stalks, I was driving in yesterday morning and I saw somebody had drilled into their corn stalks, right? So that's another example of diversity that's providing a symbiotic relationship, because they're going to plant rye in there. It's going to provide a lot of protein that's going to be missing in those corn stalks. That's going to allow the cattle to more efficiently use those corn stalks, because now the rumen environment has enough protein that the microbes are going to work more efficiently. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah, so I think just to finish up, thank you again so much for joining us. I think we covered a wide range of topics. I'm excited to see what feedback we get from our audience. Maybe there's some more specific things that they'll want us to drill down on. I know you mentioned the kind of the dual purpose wheat. That could be a good focus in the future. But setting that aside, the last question I wanted to ask you, and it's just what we ask every guest, is what's something that just excites you in your work right now? Whether, I know you mentioned you do some teaching, so whether it's with students or research or extension, just broadly, what's something that you're excited about in your work right now?
Yeah, one thing that excites me, and this is a Regen Ag podcast, so it might sound a little biased. But when I got started in the space of sustainability and regenerative ag, there wasn't a lot of producer buy-in, not because they weren't interested in it, it just they didn't know what it was. And that's shifted dramatically
Absolutely.
in the last 10 years. And I think that's a great example of our producers, whether they're farmers, ranchers, both, whatever they are, at the end of the day, they're stewards of the land. Right, and I think that we're starting to see that applied, and more people utilize regenerative approaches. And I hope that just continues. But to me, that's very exciting. And then another thing, and I was thinking about this the other day, because somebody asked me, with some changes that have occurred over the last couple of years, what's going to happen with the climate change space that we're in, and it made me realize we developed a lot of tools to measure greenhouse gases, and wouldn't you know, they have really good applications for nutritional purposes too, right? And they're actually helping us improve our understanding of energetics of grazing animals. And to me, that was really exciting. I never really thought about it. And so I hope that space continues to expand as well.
Well, that sounds like a good note to end on, and some exciting things to look forward to going forward. Just the last thing I'll ask you is, if any of our audience wanted to get in touch with you or learn more about your research and your work, where should they go to find that information?
Yeah, you can look me up on the K-State ASI webpage, or go visit our webpage at the Reynolds Ranch under the facilities tab there on both agronomy and ASI. And hopefully over the coming months, we'll be able to fill the Reynolds webpage with some interviews and some updates on what we're learning out there from a research standpoint.
Well, Dr. Logan Thompson, thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for tuning in to the K-State Regen Ag Podcast.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.